Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening whenever you're watching this. This is another exciting edition of Bible history. We're looking today at lessons 59, 61, 62, and 63. And before we get started today, I wanted to give you a little bit of a biblical timeline and review of where we are at. So Adam and Eve, first people we encountered in the Old Testament. We don't know exactly how old the earth is, but we know from the evidence that it's a relatively young earth, 10,000 to 5,000 BC. And following that, we had the flood. And I'm just putting it in there again. We don't have a date, but it happened sometime between the creation and then when we get to know about Abraham. So Noah and the flood happens between creation and what we call the patriarchs, the fathers of the faith. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived from around 2100 to 1950 BC, so 2,000 years on the other side of Christ's birth, so around 4,000 years ago. Then Jacob, he's the youngest, who was renamed Israel, and his 12 sons came next, and that was 1950 to 1800, and this would have entailed the selling of Joseph into slavery, the going down to Egypt to get food, and then the whole people of Israel, Jacob and his 12 sons, resettling in Egypt and eventually becoming slaves. And that leads us to Moses, who was born around 1524 BC. And the Exodus, when Moses led the people out of slavery in Egypt, 1446, and the Promised Land, which they ended up in 40 years after, because they had those wilderness wanderings. So 1400 BC approximately for the entrance into the Promised Land. And after that, the time of Joshua and the Judges, books of the Bible, came the conquest of the Holy Land and the time of the Judges. That's people like Deborah and Samson. You might remember their stories. All right, so our timeline continues then after the Judges with the kings. And there are 3 kings at the beginning, and then it gets kind of messy with the divided kingdom. So right now, this is kings over all of Israel. And the first king was Saul, who ruled, and you don't have to remember the dates. I really more want the order. So I'm just telling you approximately when it happened. So 1,000 years before Christ was born, King Saul. Then came King David. And Saul's sons did not become king because they were not good little boys. So then came King David, one of the sons of Jesse. And then King Solomon, who was a son of David, ruled from 970 to 931. And then the kingdom divided. And so the kingdom is divided into north and south at the end of Solomon's reign, I believe, under his son Jeroboam. And there is 2 kingdoms. Israel is in the north, and Judah is in the south. And so now today we're going to talk about the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and they are around 874 and 852 BC, so about 800 years before Christ comes. So let's take a look now. We are in lesson 59, and the first question is, why did Jezebel want to kill Elijah? And the answer is found in lesson 58, actually. You had to remember this, but Jezebel wanted to kill Elijah because Elijah had killed the prophets of Baal, who were Jezebel's favorite prophets, because they told her lies and told her what she wanted to hear. So that was last lesson's lesson, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Whoops, I got ahead of myself. When Elijah heard Jezebel's threats, what did he do? He ran away and hid in the wilderness. So he fled. Summarize Elijah's wilderness prayer. I've had enough, Lord. Take me to heaven. Or you could put it simply, Lord, I want to die. I've had enough. Question number 4, how did Elijah get food in the wilderness? An angel of the Lord brought Elijah food. Remember, that angel woke up and said, Elijah, wake up and eat, because the angel had placed food before him. Question number 5, in his cave prayer, Elijah accused Israel of these 3 things. Whoops, got the questions out of order here. First, that they had forsaken God's covenant. Second, they had thrown down God's altars. And third, they want to kill me. So these were his complaints. Israel has forsaken God's covenant. Israel has thrown down God's altars, and Israel wants to kill me. And question 6, God answered Elijah in a quiet whisper with his word. So these questions are in order. Now, question 7, why might Elijah have expected God to answer him in the form of an earthquake, strong wind, or fire? Because these things were powerful, a storm or a wind or fire, and Elijah wanted God to do something powerful about his enemies. Probably would have liked it if the Lord had taken care of Jezebel like he took care of the prophets of Baal. And question number 8 is just one word, but to give Elijah additional hope, God told him there were still 7,000 believers in Israel. So 7,000. And I don't remember if I signed you question 9 or not, but we are going to answer it. Elijah could not know how many believers were left in Israel. Why do we say the Holy Christian Church is invisible? And that question won't work because you guys, that reference in the small catechism won't work because you guys have a different catechism. But why is the church called invisible? Why couldn't Elijah see this? Well, because faith is not visible. Elijah could not see the believers because you cannot see faith. We can see people in church. We can say Redeemer has 300 or 400 members, but we cannot say how many believers does Redeemer have. We just have to take people at their word. If they say, I believe, then we say they're a believer, but we cannot see into their hearts. We cannot see faith. So that's why the church is called invisible. All right, we're going to move on to lesson 61, which is about Elijah and Elisha. Okay, and the first question is, describe the relationship between Elijah and Elisha. Elijah was Elisha's master, and Elisha served Elijah. So it was a master-servant relationship. Maybe you could say Elijah was the senior prophet and Elisha was the junior prophet. Or in like our lingo, Elijah was the head pastor and Elisha was the assistant pastor. Question number 2. Basing his request on the inheritance laws of the time, what did Elisha ask Elijah to do for him before Elijah was taken away? And what Elisha asked for was a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Question number 3. Since he could not grant an answer to such a prayer, Elijah left the answer to God. What sign would God give to show if the request had been granted? If Elisha saw Elijah taken to heaven, then he would receive the double portion. So he had to witness Elijah being taken up into heaven. Question 4. How did Elisha indicate that he had seen how Elijah had gone into heaven? He exclaimed, "The chariots of Israel and the horsemen." That indicated that he saw the chariots and the horsemen, which preceded Elijah being taken up. Now, here's a very important point if you're ever playing Bible trivia. There might be a question like, how was Elijah taken up into heaven? And a lot of people say, well, a fiery chariot. But if you read the text carefully, Elijah was not taken up into heaven. They simply appeared, the chariots and the horsemen, but he was not taken up by them. He was actually taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. Question 5. Armies with chariots and horsemen protected countries. How had Elijah been Israel's protector? Well, Elijah protected God's people by telling them God's word. This is the greatest protection you can give to someone, is to speak God's word to them, because God's word protects you from sin, from death, and from the devil. So the greatest protection you have is to have God's word. No, I didn't read the question. How did God indicate to Elisha that he was to indeed the successor to Elijah? Well, the prophets of Jericho said, "The spirit of Elijah is on Elisha." Question number 7. God wanted Elijah to be with him in heaven. Study John 17, verse 24. What does this passage teach us? Jesus wants us to be with him and see the glory that God had given him. So we have this comforting message. Jesus wants you in heaven. He does not want you to miss out. He wants you to see what glory God has worked in his Son. And the last question for this lesson: how did Elisha help the widow who lived in Samaria? Elisha miraculously gave the woman a supply of oil that she could sell so her sons wouldn't be sold as slaves. So if you remember this part of the story, this is kind of neat. Elisha tells her to go out and get all the jugs and jars and anything she can find to hold oil, and then to take her last little container of oil and pour it into all these other jugs. And she pours and pours and pours and pours, and finally comes to the last jug, and the oil runs out and all the jugs are full. And she sells the jugs of oil to anyone who has need of them. You can tell it's afternoon. I've got the yawn. Sorry about that. And sells the oil to pay her debts so her sons aren't sold into slavery. So that's the end of that story. I'm going to stop the recording here, and I'll come back and do the other 2 stories, lessons from this time in the next video. Bye for now.